Hello everyone, welcome to From Nowhere to Nothing, Ontological Oxymorons. I'm your host, Joel Bouchard, a doctoral student in psychology, and with me today is Mr. Norman Gayford, a professor of English and philosophy. If there's a topic you'd like us to cover on the show, feel free to email us at fromnowhereto-nothingpodcast@gmail.com or contact us on our Facebook page. As you listen to this episode, you likely, and hopefully, have a good sense of who you are. After all, you've lived with yourself all of your life. However, by weight, there's a good chance that what you think of as you is actually other organisms, mostly bacteria that you couldn't live without. Additionally, every second you have cells that are dying, being born, metabolizing, and in general changing. All these moving parts make up, quote, you, yet you probably don't think of yourself as being made up of separate parts. So what role do the parts play in making up the whole? Today, we're talking about Mereology.
And I should start out with this with one thing because we do have different interests among the listeners. We've heard some of that. There's a thing called Mereology, which is the theological formation of ideas and beliefs and structures around Mary, the figure of Mary in religion. And so the Holy Mother and so on and so forth. This is Mereology, M-E-R-E, which you said right. But I just want to make sure we...
Yeah, it's a good distinction, though. And it is interesting in its own way. So, maybe we'll talk about that sometime. Who knows?
So many things we can talk about, Joel.
So Mereology, this is a term that popped up in one of our other shows. I can't remember which one it was a few months ago. And I think during the show, we said, we got to do an episode on that. And then... we sort of forgot about it. And then as I was, listening to my Great Courses Plus lecture this week, the term popped back up. I go, oh yeah, Mereology. We gotta go back to that. So,
yes.
What is Mereology?
Well, I'll start and then you'll of course embellish. So starting from the basics, it's an investigation of thinking about in a lot of different ways, from a lot of different perspectives, parts and wholes, the components of structure, of how, and as you've said about human beings, we're essentially colonies of hundreds of millions of or more life forms which makes me think of the Oogie Boogie every time in Nightmare Before Christmas, but so it's used to talk about everything from musical groups to geology, to geography, to road design, to medicine. But as we were saying pre-show, it has one of the longest histories in philosophy. It starts with the pre-Socratics. It's picked up by Aristotle. It continues, but it surfaces big time again in the medieval times, and then up through all the way into the 20th century, and now it's reawakening again. Now it's like this Leviathan that just snores and then pops up, or so it seems. But what it is about is to look at the relationships between parts, or what was called parthood, and composition. So, as one of probably countless examples we're going to talk about today, a musical composition. I was at concerts this week. That's a composed set of, it's music, but it's a composition made of notes, staves, bars, clefs, and so on, but notes. And those individual notes, along with the bars, staves, and the rest, are the visual rendering of that music. There's a lot of philosophical discussion. And my son's a musician and a teacher of this. So, but are the notes on the page the music, or is the music what you actually do because of the notes on the page? So that's a Mereological discussion in a sense.
Yeah. No, and I really like that example. I think I'm going to bring it back up a little bit later in the episode when we get to a little bit deeper into the discussion. But Yeah, so this idea of looking at parts of things, and I like the way that you described it too as being a leviathan, right? Because it is sort of that way, right? It's this ancient, archaic thing, and it of sort of paramount importance in a lot of ways. You know, like we had said, the pre-Socratics and Plato and Aristotle, these guys, they put a lot of thought, you know, in the Parmenides and you know, looking into, how do parts of wholes work? And if you think about it, that seems intuitively to be something that is very important philosophically, and is accessible to anybody regardless of technological or scientific education. You know, you can look at the world around you and go, what is the parts that makes up stuff around us? You know, and what constitutes a whole thing, and you know, really sort of get lost in how that all works, trying to figure it out. So do you want to cover some of what that history was, what some of the thinking was on?
Let's start with the most I would argue is probably the most famous, which is Aristotle, who says, if I say the first part, I can just hear voices everywhere saying, the whole is more than the sum of its parts.
Right.
Well, okay. That's a pretty thick idea, really, if you go both denotatively and connotatively, metaphorically and literally. How can a whole be more than its parts? But referencing the music thing.
Yeah, I'm thinking about my intro last week with the how it's made, right? Okay, you have an engine block, and then you have a piston, and by themselves, they don't do anything, right? But if you put enough of the parts together, all of a sudden you have something that can create a ton of power, you know, enough to move 2 tons of metal down the road at, you know, 80 miles an hour. But
and then we go from Aristotle up through a number of others following him, but building on the Platonic idea, really, that there's an idealism, a Mereological idealism, which is a way of looking at things that says composite objects exist because their constituent parts are co-apprehended by a mind under a concept. This is when we're heading into the medieval world, right? And so essentially saying that a mind can see parts and put it together into something bigger. Well, we know this, don't we? But yet to think about how do we manage to do that is part of the development of Mereology. So, I'll hear a bunch of if I put this here, I put this here, I put this here, I make a clock. How did I do that? Well, I had to plan it. How did I plan it? Well, I either conceived of components that I would need, or I saw them sitting on a shelf. But you see, the thing that's interesting is how did I conceive of that? How would I know that I needed a gear?
Right.
How would I know what size the gear should be? Well, that would entail knowing what size I wanted the clock to be. And so then I go, because I want to keep it on the ground always with us. We always do that, and light as well as heavy. And so I'm thinking of Geppetto's workshop in the old Pinocchio film, if you've ever watched it. And you see a number of different, very clever clocks working. But then you see the gears inside of some of those clocks. And Geppetto, puppet master, clock master, would have had to figure out what parts do I need to do that? And to me, as somebody whose father was a mechanic, that's always front and center in my mind. There are always parts sitting around. There are always tools, and somehow that comes together into a composite whole that functions or is reintegrated into a thing that functions. And so that's the development of the idea.
Yeah.
And then it moves further and into, as you said before the show, we're talking about into the 20th century, where it becomes it sort of divides into two very separate extreme positions. And I'll let you expound on that.
Yeah. So, are you talking about like how you can view parts and wholes?
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So, basically when you're looking at how parts integrate into wholes, you can go to polar positions, right? And the one is that wholes don't exist, right? The only thing that exists is parts. And so, in this view, you just have atoms and, that's pretty much it. Like they're just free floating, and therefore it's really just humans that are applying concepts to these things in order to give them some sort of meaning or value, but it doesn't really exist. And this position is rightfully called nihilism, right? The view that there isn't anything. There is no wholes, there's only parts. And then on the other side, all the way on the other side of the spectrum, you have this four-dimensional, and I think there might even be one beyond that, but view that there are no parts, right? Everything is just one thing. You have the cosmos, the universe, that is the whole, and everything is just part of that, right?
Or time as a block, as we've talked about.
Yes,
before.
yes. Yeah. So there's no movement. There's nothing that is actually happening. There's just this whole block universe, and neither one of those positions is really intuitive or appeals to most people's sort of thought. And there are logical inconsistencies that can be poked into either one. So usually people are trying to go, down a qualified middle way, but the problem is that those are usually some of the least consistent of all. So it becomes very complicated.
It does. And it went into very quantitative, empirical, always logical, but renderings using alphabetic elements, right? And to try to explain how one thing, if a part is part of a whole, then that part is the same as the whole, and those kind of things. WHOLE and the whole, and that's interesting, and it's necessary as part of the discussion. Part of the discussion. But I was thinking about this a lot this week when we hit on the topic, is what's the most obvious thing for most of us in one way or another at some experience in our life? And I'm thinking of a lawnmower shop, of a garage, something where places have stated rooms that are called parts. The parts supply. There's a parts room. When I worked for a summer at a farm equipment repair place that my dad worked at, and I got a job sweeping the oil, the cat litter particles absorbing the oil and mowing the grass and that kind of stuff. But I watched a lot. And it was always interesting because people congregated most at the parts room. And what you just said about the nihilistic, well, mechanics aren't nihilistic. There's got to be a part. If there's not a part there, we'll order it. If that part's not available, we'll make it.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And because we're going to make that machine function. And that's all well and good, but I think that it also, we have to think of the Mereological analysis that not just mechanics do, but nurses, doctors, or if they engage in it, and the ones with integrity do. So here's this machine, this human thing, and they look at us, they examine us. What are your symptoms? Symptoms being, well, what seems not to be right? And we try to articulate that. And sometimes we're good at it, and sometimes we're really not good at it at all. And so they run us through tests with sensors and chemicals that try to, what's going on with this machine? And then they take reasonable guesses, which are sometimes right maybe even oftentimes right, depending on the doctor. But they're engaging in Mereological analysis. What's not functioning in part of the body that's causing the sensation of pain or illness or unwellness? And for me, that's where the rubber hits the road. That's where the Mereological analysis is important to talk about. Or in something like businesses, where a business will decide that for purposes of profit, it'll downsize, send the business somewhere else, and the people that it keeps will then take on more responsibility. Well, all of those people are parts of the whole that is the company, and some of the parts are just being thrown out. And some are being said, well, you're not only going to do this job, but that job and this other job too. And it's not just companies, it's of all businesses. And it shouldn't be called a business, but education. And well, how do you get a gear to do three different things?
Yeah.
In a process or a structure? I think if you reduce it to those things, it's as you said, intuitive.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think that's a really good overview of Mereology and like the importance of it. So we'll get just the barest bit technical, just so that people have an idea of like how to frame some of the cool stuff we're going to talk about in a few minutes.
Go for it.
So do you want to cover the three sort of axioms of Mereology that the different theories all share in common? Or did you look at those much?
I did, but I'm going to find which screen I have the notes on for that, because I don't want to misrepresent the technicalities of it.
Yeah.
I don't want to overthrow it.
Yeah. So the three axioms are sort of reflexivity, transitivity and anti-symmetry.
When do we think of reflexivity? I think a lot of people's minds will first go to reflex.
Right. You produce something and then something gives you feedback against it. Right.
Right. And so with a part and a whole, how is the part functioning within that whole in the sense of what does the whole require of the part, and how that whole communicates it and how the part hands it back. That's one way of looking at reflexivity.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and another way that they look at it is this sort of axiom, right? That a part, the whole is a part of the whole, right? So
and there's the concept.
So Joel is part of Joel, right? Yeah. So I can't, which is, you and I were talking about a pre-show, like this is, all three of these, right? These are all things. What it's funny in doing the research, they say that there's a lot of different views of Mereology, and there's a lot of conflicting things, but they say, most all of them agree on these three things. But then as soon as they say it and they start explaining it, they go, yeah, but not everybody agrees on it.
Right. Yeah. They slide right into that. Every article you read. I was reading, I indulged in reading a couple of professional papers, and yep, here it is, but we're going to move away because.
And we're going to talk about that in a little bit. And I'm going to bring back your musical example when we do. But again, it's not time. That's sort of a refresher for me to remind me not to forget about.
So are things parts of themselves?
Yeah, that's sort of the question with reflexivity, right? Is me as a whole a part of me, right? Is the part and the whole synonymous? Like and
I can't help but think you've put me there with this example, and some of the Stanford Encyclopedia does this. So we refer to ourselves sometimes as me, myself, and I. Are we all one?
Right, because and another one that I saw was the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit,
Trinities.
Right? And so in Christian theology, right, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, each one of them is a separate being, but they are all God. Each one of them, And so me, myself, and I, you go, I don't know if that's a one-to-one correspondence with the Father, the Son, the Holy Spirit, right? Because if you
God.
do, then the breakdown of the human becomes a bit schizophrenic, right?
Mhm.
You go, well, if I think of me, myself, and I all as separate parts, but all wholly me, you go, well, maybe it does make sense. I don't know, but
Holy me, Batman.
it's a conceptual struggle, isn't it, to think of things that way?
It is. That this is one of the rougher goes, and it's good we're going there because we've got to deliver some heft. Okay, so that's the reflex, and then we want to do the transitive.
Yeah.
All right, and so let's do a question and answer for a minute. Just to bring people more into it, when you think of transitive, the word transitive, what comes through your head?
What pops into my head is something moving, something going from one place or one thing to another place and another thing.
Yep.
And I guess in a way that's sort of what it's saying, right? What it's saying is that something that is a part of a part. So if you have a part of a whole, a part of that part is also a part of the whole. So if my foot is part of my leg and my leg is part of my body, then my foot is a part of my body.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So that's sort of the transitivity property. And that one seems okay to me. I have a hard, I don't struggle with that one as much as with
reflex.
Yeah. Reflexivity. It just seems sort of redundant, or it's sort of it sort of gets you to engage in the nihilistic view where you go, okay, well, if an engine block is a part and a piston is a part and a spark plug is a part, and you put everything together and you have the whole engine and the engine is a part of the engine, you go, well, what's the point in even conceptualizing wholes? The engine might as well just be a part, right, of a car, or, and just parts all the way down, right? So why do we need holes anyways?
Precisely that. It leads us to that, but it also opens the door to talking about the nature of identity. And I think that's part of the reason that it's there.
Yeah.
And the ship of Theseus sails by.
Yep. And that's an important Mereological example, right?
It really is.
But yeah, transitivity, that one I don't struggle with as much. It seems to make sense.
How
right?
are you with anti-symmetry?
Now, what's funny is this is one of those. Yeah, this is one of those ones where when I was reading, they go, well, and if you subscribe to transitivity, then anti-symmetry just follows. And I go, how so? I'm struggling with that a little bit. And after doing some reading, it did make a little bit more sense. But yeah, at first I struggled with it.
Yeah, I think it's a struggle because what we consider when we use the word asymmetry in ordinary or more ordinary circumstances, we aren't talking about exactly the same thing as it's being used in this circumstance. I have to admit that this one is ever the most difficult.
Yeah,
for me. And lots of things are difficult for me, but I think that if you put it in the context of the previous two, and I know that there will be some hearing this who would scoff, but trying to adhere to something of what we know of asymmetry, that. And the Stanford's not saying this. This is me. Some parts are more important, or more hefty, more full of weight, more influential in the system than others. But if some parts are more influential in the system than others, and yet that more influential part is the whole. Part is going back to the reflexive, then no system is, to me, arguably smooth or full of equality, or all the concepts we like to think that there may be balance. There's balance in the force, but That doesn't mean that there's not going to be something that has more influence sometimes or less influence than others.
Yeah, this happens to me at work a lot, right? Like, okay, I know some mechanical stuff, but I'm not a mechanic or an engineer. But I'm in charge of making sure that stuff gets made.
Yep.
So lots of times people will come to me with our old presses, right? And they'll go, hey, one of the mechanics, hey, this thing's broken. And to me, a non-mechanic, that doesn't mean anything, right? So the next question that I ask is, how bad is it? Right? Because sometimes what they'll say is, oh, well, hey, yeah, this thing broke. So your engine oil, your hydraulic oil is going to be running, pretty hot. So the operators will have to keep an eye on that. And then if it gets so hot, the system will shut it down automatically and it will, you won't be able to run anymore. But we don't know if it's going to get that hot or not. So we might as well keep running and see what happens, right? And then there's other things where they go, hey, this broke. And I go, how bad is it? They go, your press is now just a bunch of pieces that serve no function. It's just a giant hunk of metal pieces, right? It's not a press because it can't do any work, And so that's sort of an anti-symmetry there, right? Like you were just saying, there are certain parts of this whole that are more important to its functioning, because if they don't work, then the thing ceases to function the way it's intended, right? I guess with human beings, right? If I have a finger amputated, I can continue to live as a human being.
Yeah.
If I have my heart removed, I cannot continue to live as a human being. Right?
There's a word that comes up with this in some of the academic presentation, and it's the word improper. And the trouble with, again, the words is that they bear such connotative implications. So here's a different take on anti-symmetry. Anti-symmetry says that if X and Y are objects with the same improper parts, then X equals Y. Well, to use your example, if there's an unusually influential part that's rendering the whole machine a bucket of both, useless essentially, that's an improper part. Well, of course it is, Norm. It's broken. but if it's part of extension, we're extending. I demand this of myself to try to put things in terms. We're extending the importance, or extending the importance of one thing into the functionality of the whole, and then rendering a value judgment about the whole for its teleology, for its purpose for existing, so that it could be said that machine that's going to be rendered into parts, those parts could be used in other places. Perhaps those parts can be melted down and reused. It's not that they're useless or improper, but they are in the composition of that particular thing.
Yeah. So anti-symmetry is a difficult thing to wrap your head around. It is, but I think that was pretty good. So, and there's different ways that Mereologists conceptualize parts, right? And there's a whole list. I mean, I found, I think, 18 different qualifications, right?
Yeah.
In order to be a part of something, and this is all trying to determine what constitutes a
partness,
a whole, right?
Yeah, what constitutes what makes something a part, and part how? How is it a part?
Yeah.
That's what all those categories are about.
Right. And so if you have the nihilistic view that everything is parts, or you have a four-dimensional view that the whole universe is one part, right? So if the whole universe is one part, right? I think that the example I found is they said, well, then my big toe and a neutron star in our galaxy and a dust cloud at 3 galaxies over all those three things together are a part, or a whole.
A whole of the
Right.
universe.
And you go, well, that doesn't seem to really...
That doesn't work.
Yeah.
No.
So they try to establish all these rules to say what constitutes a part of a whole, right? And some of them are, one of them is, well, the parts have to be in contact, right? They have to be touching each other. But you can sort of find some scenarios where this doesn't hold, right? If I have like an RC car, the controller is kind of part of the whole set, right? Because without the controller, the car doesn't do anything. Right?
Without the mouse, before you had touch screens, the computer wouldn't do anything.
Right. So this idea of being in contact, you go, I don't know. Seems like, but there are philosophers that would argue that, well, no, the controller is not part of the car. The car is a whole in itself, and the controller is a whole in itself, and they just interact.
So we stop and say, well, I stopped and say, so, okay, so how is that helpful?
Right.
And you in manufacturing, and with your plethora of activities and interests and pursuits, which are not all the same thing, might say one response for that machine and a different response for a pick with a guitar. Is a pick necessary to operate a guitar? Well, no, because fingers operate the guitar. Well, well, sure, you can use a spoon. You can tap on a guitar. People have experimented with all kinds of sound, right? And so what's necessary for guitar to be guitar as played?
Yeah. And that's the big mereological question, right? Is what constitutes a whole and what parts are needed for that whole to exist? So yeah. I think that leads into the next question pretty well, which is there a limit to what can be studied mereologically?
No, I don't think so. If you embrace all of the abstraction and projection hypothesizing.
Yeah, I found that this was a point of contention among different philosophers. But yeah, I think that the more academically or sort of logically inclined want to sort of exclude certain things because it doesn't fall into the sort of patterns and rules that they've created. Yeah. But I think that that's just sort of
that's a limitation.
Yeah. I think that you're artificially imposing limitations in order to prove your hypothesis and your theory about mereology rather than an actual clean break between what can and can't be studied. If you just look at the concept as a whole, right? Okay, well, how do parts interact?
Yeah.
I think that pretty much opens up everything in our physical reality. It's hard to think of something that couldn't be studied.
It is indeed. And while I don't want to try to render everything mechanistic, but I'm going to jump over the creek with 2 or 3 stones. Splash. Is it possible to make a given machine operate without having all of its parts? This is, to me, where it hits the ground again and has usefulness in direct application. If I'm in a situation where I need to get someplace from A to B, my vehicle is broken down, and if I can isolate then maybe the 3 or 4 things have gone wrong. Is it possible for me to get there with 3 tires instead of 4? Is it possible, depends on the vehicle, to get there with 1 tire instead of 2? Is what can be cobbled together? What can be done at the very least in order to make something run? And I think we can think of probably endless examples of this, from action movies to real life to, Star Trek, where Scotty has to do something with the engineering to just get the ship to hobble along just a little bit. We can hobble it. Can we get a vehicle started? We can hobble it along the side of the road to get somewhere. There's the mechanistic. This is next one, second stone, splash. this one really bothers me because some of even in the Stanford article, it got a little bit too unwholesome for me, and in the sense that it was saying, well, a human being has to have certain requisite parts to be considered a human being. Eyes. How dare you, sir?
Yeah. Right.
You know, so I'm not a human being if I don't have eyes. And then I'm going to take it a step further. Maybe I was born without eyes. Maybe I have eyes and I'm losing my sight. But how dare you suggest that I'm less human because I have 2 ears? Okay, so 1 ear doesn't, So I think that this becomes very important in an ethical sense.
Yeah, and it's important as philosophers to examine how those two things interact, right? Like you were talking about with the car. All right, we've all driven down the road and seen somebody's muffler or somebody's bumper laying on the side of the road. We know that there's still a car out driving out there somewhere, right? If you see an engine block laying on the side of the road, you know that car didn't drive away, right? Well, with human beings, right? So that's a mechanistic view. And I think that any of them who say that a human being needs eyes, right? These are those ones that want to put limitations on what can be seen mereologically, right? Mm-hmm. Well, no, I've constructed this logical, rational conception of what a whole and parts are, and so therefore we're not going to really consider human beings. Well, that's an artificial thing, right? But it does make the conversation much messier, right? Because we can get really scientific, really science fiction with it, right? We can go, okay, well, what if we've uploaded my brain onto a computer, right? And so my consciousness is on the computer, but my body is gone. Is that still a human being, right? And I think that that's the point where a lot of people will go, oh, okay, well, somebody born with no eyes, I can definitely identify them as being human. And, a quadruple amputee or whatever the cases are, right? We've seen these examples and we know that these people are human. We have actual contact with them,
like
right?
Anybody else, yes.
But if you get rid of the body completely, if it's possible, right? You get rid of the body completely, somebody's uploaded into a computer, is that still a human being, right? And you go, I think that, and then it raises discussions about, can you separate the human being from the person, right? Because I think that the natural inclination, right, would be to say that is still the person, but it might not be the human being.
Right. So now we get to the word being, and this takes us right back to where Mereology lives, where it began, really, which is the ontological, the study of being.
Yeah.
What constitutes the being of, and not being as in flesh and blood, the existence of let's say that a car is a being. Let's say that a drum set has being. What is the minimal amount that you need to have something to be considered a drum set? These are questions that I think are, they seem superficial and ridiculous, but if you just take them a little ways, you might see what it can do. Now we're getting into ethics again. How artificial categorizations could be unnecessarily limiting to or dismissive of things that people engage in. That not everybody can afford a full drum set, whatever a full drum set would be. How many tin hats do you need? How many? What constitute? What if I have just some pans and a pots and pans and some aluminum foil and a wooden, or maybe a metal rod and a wooden spoon? Could I say that I have a drum set? And why would I tell somebody, oh, it's not a drum set? Am I doing that out of a sense of need to be superior? Am I therefore undermining somebody's creative possibilities because maybe someday they will be able to acquire what is constituted or considered a drum set by functioning upper class society? I don't. You see where I'm going with this?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and that it's a great question. It takes me to like not abstract art, but sort of like the Cubist movement and some of that stuff, where there's a lot of deconstructing, not just the human form, but a lot of other forms and reconfiguring things in different ways.
Yeah.
And seeing what could still be identified as the thing that it was, right? Same thing with the drum set, right? How poor of a quality or how diverse of a quality of things would you need to have before you could say that it's no longer a drum set, right? And so in a way, it's the ship of Theseus argument in a way, right? If I have something that's serving as a kick drum, it's providing a bass thud, and I have something that's serving as a snare drum, it's a backbeat and it's a higher pitch, and I have something that's serving as different cymbals and different hi-hats. If those things are serving that purpose and I'm utilizing them in that purpose, regardless of the composition of the thing itself, is it a drum set? Or do you need a kick drum, a snare drum, toms, and cymbals for it to be a drum set? And this is the ship of Theseus argument, right? This idea that, you have the ship and you replace the boards.
Yep.
Well, is the ship in the boards, right? The second you take away the first board, does it cease to be the ship of Theseus? Or as long as you maintain the form and the function of what it was, that's the ship. But then that raises the problem that, well, if you remove all the old boards and use new boards, and then you reconstruct the old ship with all the old boards, well, now which one's the ship of Theseus, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And this is a problem that we've talked about extensively on the show, and we'll continue to talk about it here in a couple minutes, but I think there's an even more interesting one that's more suited to the Mereological question, which is the special composition question, right? And this one is sort of exemplified by the view that, okay, I have a lump of clay and I carve up this lump of clay into a statue. So now is the statue and the clay, right? We're going back to our axioms that we talked about earlier.
Yep.
Okay, well now does X equal Y, right? The clay is the same as the statue, right? So the statue is clay. But was the clay before it's carved the statue, right? How do those things interact? And this is where, in a lot of the research that I did, again, the people who want to make Mereology non-complicated, right? They want to systematize it and say that they have all of the answers, ignore this question. They put it out of their minds. But it's very important, right? I think that
it is very important. And this is going to be a quick sweep. Remember when we started out 5 years ago? So we started out, or was it 6?
Yeah,
we're going
on
six.
it.
We're going into 6. We talked about essentially 10 big ideas, right? And we talked about philosophy, the largest categories, metaphysics and ontology and so on. Well, now we're right back to it again, except we're into aesthetics. There are sculptors, some with chainsaws, some with clay, some with marble, who have across time said, the shape is within and I am releasing it. And that is how they approach the material. There are those of us who do art. You do art, Joel. There's those of us who do art. Whether it's ink, whatever. I was working with ink this week again. That I say that I am listening to the ink. It makes a really interesting sound on different kinds of paper. I'm listening to the ink. I'm watching where the ink goes, and then working with the ink to bring out something. And sometimes I'm not even sure what I'm bringing out, and then there it is. So to rudimentarily say, no, the clay doesn't have this. It's the clay. It's just the clay. The clay isn't the art. Is to utterly ignore the importance of the creative process.
Yeah. So again, where this term Mereology came up for me was in Great Courses Plus. We're not sponsored by them. This isn't a commercial. I do suggest them. It's great. But
yes.
Anyways, I'm taking this course on the meaning of life, right? And it's taught by this great philosophy professor. And so this is where the term came up. And what was very interesting to me is as he's walking through all of the classical religions and philosophies, then through all the modern philosophers, and giving the different views on the meaning of life that people have had throughout history. And what he said that was interesting to me, and it comes right to this question, is that you can really split them all up into two categories. And the two categories are those who see the good life, the meaningful life, as being something that you aspire to and that you build towards and that you have to work at to achieve. And those who view the meaningful life as the negative space. You have to strip away all of the other things that have happened, right? You already know what the meaningful life is. You were born with the meaningful life, but everything else is inhibiting it. So you have to strip all of that away. So it's Taoism versus Confucianism, right?
Yes,
Stoicism versus, so you have these two different conceptions, right? And it really is like that. You have, if you're somebody who looks at the clay or looks at the marble, right, and says, I need to put a lot of work into this to make it a statue, then you're building towards something. You're working towards something. It's virtuous and skillful to be able to do that. But if you're somebody who says, the statue is already there, I'm just releasing it from its form, then you're probably a Taoist or a Stoic. Somebody who says, no, we already have it inside of us. We just have to find it, right?
Because what you said about negative space is really an important crossing with the art, because as I've been taught with my teacher in art, is you don't have the tree unless you have the space behind the tree, which defines the tree. The space is what defines form, and that's Zen.
Yeah. I mean, that's the whole idea behind a lot of those Eastern religions, specifically Taoism and Zen, right? Is this idea that what holds us back as human beings is our conceptualization of things, right? Perception is what is real. Conception is what is wrong, right? And so if you look at the world and you see things as they are, rather than imposing a meaning, a framework, a conception on top of it, right? Rather than trying to take the parts and make them into wholes that you can identify, you just see the things as they are, then that is what is real, right? And so that's kind of a good example of how Mereology influences kind of metaphysical and religious views of reality. But it's not one, like I said, it sort of goes two ways, right? Because you can view it the other way. And I think the other way is more intuitive, right? To say, no, certainly the clay or the marble is not a statue, right? It's not a statue until we do something to it to make it a statue. So in an interesting contrast.
Well, because we have to engage with it, and that from either direction, there's an engagement with it, either to release the Kraken or release the creature, the sculpture within, or to build it. There's this works for me from a completely different sense. When I said that, I've met people who tell me that they are writers over time, not just in my classes when I was teaching, but often I would encounter people. I'm a writer. Oh, okay. And how do you go about your process? Or let's talk about, well, I haven't written anything in a long time because I'm just thinking about it, but I've got all of these stories in my head, and that's what makes me a writer. And at that point, whether there's an essentialism involved or whatever one might call it, then I sort of am doing the poker game of I'm saying, okay, I call. Let's do some writing. And because otherwise that wholeness, whatever it is in the mind, if it's a whole composition, if the whole novel that you've written is in your mind, but it's not anywhere to be accessed, then arguably you might well be a compositionist. You've composed it, but you're not a writer until something is written.
Yeah, that's the interesting, complex part of about humans, right? Is we have this ability to conceptualize the marble as a statue, right? But until we put chisel to stone, there is no statue, right? There's an interesting Zen parable that sort of highlights this, where there's an old Zen master, and he had this vase that was very old and very ornate and expensive and things, and it was in his personal quarters, and one of the monks was tasked with cleaning his quarters, and he accidentally bumped the statue while he was dusting and broke it, and he was very upset, right? And he goes to the master and he says, I'm so sorry I broke the statue, please don't banish me from the monastery. And the master, who's known for being very strict and hard, right? He says, oh, don't worry about it. And the guy says, I expected you to be much more upset that I broke the vase. And the master said, in my mind, the vase was already broken, right? And so that's this idea, right, of a vision into the future, right? This view of impermanence, right? At some point, the vase will be broken, because if you give time long enough, the vase breaks, right? And at some point, the vase did not exist. And so it came into being. But at some point, it was not a vase. It was broken, right?
It was out of being, yes.
Right. It's the same thing with everything that we engage in, right? Whether it's the art, right? The art may exist in our heads, but it does not exist yet. And then once we create it, now it's there, but it's not the thing that we had envisioned, right?
Okay.
At some point, it'll fade into obscurity. It'll cease to exist. And the same thing with us as well. We come in and out of existence and we fade to exist. So this, I think that's where the nihilistic conception of Mereology rears its head again and says, you see, wholes are really just illusory, right? There's just a bunch of parts that come together and float apart, and we give meaning to them, but really there's only parts. There is no wholes, right? And now I'm going to come back to what you were talking about at the very beginning with Ian with the musical notes, right? Yeah. Talking about, well, is the music the notes on the page, or is it the sound in our ears? And I think the interesting thing about that, right, is that you can extend that question even further, right? You can look at the notes on the page and say, okay, here's a quarter note and a whole note, and here's the treble and the bass clef, and here's the stabs, and all right, well, so is that music? And you can create all kinds of arguments for why or why that may not be music. And then you can listen to the musicians playing that music, and you go, well, is this the music, right? And you can construct arguments for why or why not that might be, right? You might say, okay, well, it's a pianist, playing this piece on a piano, but really it was written for an orchestra, so it's not really the music. It's part of the music. It's not the music. You can look at timbre, right? How the instruments resonate in the space. You can look at so many different aspects of what music is, right? That you can really get lost and say, well, now I don't know what music is. And that is an important thing that I came across, was that the important thing in mereological study is that in all of the proofs, right, in all of the axioms, all of the things, they all say, if this exists, this must exist. But the qualifying word there is exists, right?
Yeah.
There's no firm definition for what exists means. And so therefore, there's nothing that says every one of those perspectives is wrong or right or can't coexist. They all can. And all of them together, in my view, right? All of them together is music. But that just creates a very complex view of it that strips that single word of the simple conceptuality that gives it, that thing. It highlights to me the limitations of language.
And you've said that so well. You've followed your own argument through so well on that. I think what to cant it just a bit, but to really try to highlight what you're saying, it's that road is back to idealism. That road is back to a kind of platonic, all right, such that there is the music, the piece of music, right? Somehow the perfect, where it was in the mind, where it's rendered. But when it comes out, when it's actually rendered, and then moves through various, it's arranged. The word arranged is very cool in music, I think, because it comes right out and says what it's doing. I'm rearranging things. I'm messing with it. I'm playing with it. I'm making a version, not the music. And my friend who I have learned so much from, discussions of theater, Peter, he would say, he has said in our talks, there's no such thing as the perfect theater performance, and there's the ideal performance of anything can't be achieved, but you keep trying to get closer and closer to it. And as you said before, I think Mereology can be such that it becomes so mathematical that the potential joy and guidance it can give into creativity or productivity gets lost in the equal signs.
Yeah. I think that was said really well. The Platonic ideal of the music is imaginary, right? Because when we look at that example, is the sheet music the music? Yes. Is the piano playing the symphony part music? Yes. Is the symphony playing the music? Yeah. If you play it on guitar instead of French horn, is it the music? Yes. It's all music, right? It's just different,
incarnations.
Different incarnations of it. But yeah, we went and saw a comedian a few weeks ago, and he said something interesting, right? He goes, I love these shows. He's like, I'm about to film. The next show I'm going to do is going to be my Netflix special, right? And he goes, and those are always fun. He's like, but whenever I go back and watch them, he's like, I always see that, there's things that are included that are great. He's like, but you know what? Each show is different, right? And there are some jokes that on the special won't land that here are the best part of the show, right? And he goes, and that's what makes touring around special, is every show's different, every crowd is different, every joke, even if it's the same joke, is a different joke because of how the audience interacts with it, right? Mm-hmm. And that's the same thing that goes with the music, right? When you listen to the music, if you were trying to establish what is the music, well, is the music the perfect Platonic form of it, the one that emerges from the mind of the writer? Because I've heard plenty of cover versions of songs that are better than the one that, to my mind, mm-hmm. than the original. But other people would disagree and say the original's better. Other people would disagree and say that a different cover's right. So I think that's where Mereology, this whole attempt to systematize it, is difficult, is because I think it looks at it as being this bottom-up thing where parts make up a whole, but really it's a two-way street, right? There's parts that make up wholes, and then there are also wholes that make up parts, right? And it's this lost complexity that is interactive in a way that complicates the issue beyond simple logical proofs, I think, in some ways.
Yes, yes, because we go to the intuitive, and I think what you just said, it's the only thing I want to add to that is or clarification. This is where it is useful, because Mereology gives us the conceptual vocabulary to, just in parts and whole. Just if you just went to that, let alone all the axioms and so on, but they're important. But is to say, well, okay, so how did that part make that piece of music or that performance of that show or that translation of the Odyssey. How did that particular way of saying the line, which was slightly different than a different translation of it, take me more to the character or push me away? So rather than just engage in a relativism that says, well, I like it, you didn't, you like it, I didn't, and so there it is, and it doesn't lead us anywhere. Say, but all right, but what parts of it worked for you?
Yeah. And there's an interesting thing that a guy was saying about the Tao Te Ching. It's an interesting text because you can interpret it so many different ways. And none of the interpretations are wrong, but each one of them sort of cant the text towards different things because of the translation of the word way, right? You can use it as a general way, right? And then the text maintains this sort of mysterious, esoteric kind of thing. But you can also, put way as path or as give it a language sort of connotation, the word or like there's multiple different ways you can interpret it. And then the message behind it changes, not completely, right? It's not relativistic, but the message becomes tailored to a different aspect of what it is that you're looking at, whether it's language, how you teach and how you learn, or whether it's path, how you live your life, how things go, or whether it's way, the entire universe and the cosmos and sort of the very fabric and nature of reality. The lessons are all similar, but it's for different aspects of how it is.
Now you've hit on the asymmetry.
Yeah.
Because the changes can be ascribed to how much attention we give to that individual part. And so that elevates it from or magnifies it more than the other parts.
Yeah, exactly. This is good. I'm really glad that we came back to Mereology. So until next time, keep pondering.